Julian Ashford stood by the towering glass windows of his penthouse, staring down at the glittering skyline of the city he practically owned. The Ashford Group was days away from finalizing the most lucrative acquisition in its century-long history. There was just one obstacle. The conservative board of directors on the opposing side demanded a merger with a stable, family-oriented leader. Julian was known as a ruthless corporate shark, a reputation made worse by his ex-fiancée, Penelope Ashby. Penelope was a manipulative socialite who, furious over their broken engagement, had just leaked a highly exaggerated story to the press about his reckless personal life. Julian needed to repair his image immediately. He needed a fiancée, someone respectable, quiet, and completely immune to the toxic glamour of his world. His gaze drifted to the sprawling gardens of his family estate the following afternoon. There, sitting on a woven blanket beneath a massive oak tree, was Sienna Hayes. She was the nanny hired to care for his younger sister's children. Sienna was a mystery. She dressed in simple, unbranded clothing, wore her dark hair tied back effortlessly, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that always made Julian look twice. She never batted an eye at the luxury around her. She never tried to catch his attention like the other women in his orbit. That evening, the Ashford estate hosted its annual summer gala. The gardens were transformed into a sea of silk, champagne, and diamonds. Penelope Ashby was there, drifting through the crowd with a triumphant smile, making sure every investor heard her fabricated tales of Julian's unreliability. Julian watched his life's work being threatened by petty gossip. He made a split-second decision. He needed a shield, and he needed it now. Sienna was standing near the terrace doors, keeping a watchful eye on the children who were allowed to stay for the first hour of the event. Julian walked straight toward her, the crowd naturally parting for him. He felt the eyes of the room, including Penelope's, tracking his every move. Julian stopped in front of Sienna, pulling a velvet box from his tuxedo pocket. Inside was a diamond ring he had purchased weeks ago for a different failed publicity stunt. He looked down at her, his voice low but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. "Sienna," he said, "I am offering you $2 million to put this ring on your finger and play the role of my fiancée for the next 6 months. It is a simple business transaction. You will want for nothing." Sienna looked at the glittering diamond, then up into Julian's dark, expectant eyes. The music seemed to fade. Guests nearest to them fell silent, straining to hear. Penelope took a step closer, a mocking smirk playing on her lips, waiting for the humble nanny to burst into tears of gratitude. Instead, Sienna's expression hardened. She did not reach for the box. She did not blush or stutter. When she spoke, her voice was crystal clear, ringing across the quieted terrace. "Mr. Ashford," Sienna began, her tone perfectly even, "I am an employee in this house, not an asset you can purchase to fix your public relations disaster. Keep your money and your ring. I am not for sale." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Penelope's smirk vanished, replaced by sheer shock. Julian froze. For the first time in his 32 years of life, he had been told no. Not in a boardroom, but in his own home, in front of the city's elite, by a woman who made barely enough to rent a small apartment. Before he could formulate a response, Sienna turned gracefully, gathered the children, and walked back into the house without a backward glance. The humiliation burned, but as Julian stood there listening to the frantic whispers of his guests, a strange realization washed over him. Sienna's public rejection was exactly what he needed. No one could ever claim she was a gold digger or a hired actress now. She had just proven her integrity to the entire world. He did not just want her for the role anymore. He needed her. Later that night, long after the guests had departed, Julian found Sienna in the estate's sprawling library. She was shelving a row of children's books, bathed in the soft glow of a reading lamp. He closed the heavy mahogany doors behind him. "I suppose you are here to fire me," Sienna said without turning around. Julian walked slowly across the Persian rug. "Quite the opposite," he replied. "I'm here to negotiate." Sienna turned to face him, her chin tilted upward in defiance. "I meant what I said outside. I will not be a pawn in your games with Penelope." Julian held her gaze. "I know. That is precisely why it has to be you." My investors saw what happened tonight. They saw a woman with absolute moral clarity reject a billionaire. If a woman like you were to actually fall in love with me, or at least pretend to, it would validate my character in a way no PR firm ever could." Sienna crossed her arms. "And why would I ever agree to that?" "Because I know you have a secret," Julian lied, testing the waters. He saw the microscopic flinch in her posture, the sudden stillness in her eyes. It was a bluff, but it hit a nerve. Julian did not know that Sienna was actually the runaway heiress of the Whitfield empire, a woman who had abandoned her massive fortune after discovering her family's wealth was built on the ruin of innocent lives. She had sought refuge in anonymity. "I will give you whatever you want," Julian continued, stepping closer. "Name your price. Not in cash for yourself, if that offends your principles. I will fund any charity, build any school, fix any problem you have. In return, you stand by my side until the merger is complete, and I swear to you I will not dig into your past." Sienna studied his face, searching for a trap. She desperately needed funds to secretly compensate the families her father had wronged, something she could never achieve on a nanny's salary. And Julian's promise to leave her past alone was the perfect cover. 6 months, Sienna said softly, the tension in the room suddenly palpable. "We sleep in separate rooms. We speak as equals. And you fund the Carter Foundation with a blind donation of $5 million by tomorrow morning." Julian felt a strange thrill at her demands. He extended his hand. "You have a deal, Miss Hayes. Let the charade begin." The transition from the quiet gardens of the estate to the blistering spotlight of Julian's world was immediate and unforgiving. Within days, Sienna found herself navigating high society galas and ruthless corporate dinners, playing the part of the devoted fiancée. Julian expected her to stumble under the weight of the scrutiny, but Sienna moved through the elite circles with an eerie, flawless grace. At a charity auction, when Penelope Ashby intentionally spilled red wine on Sienna's borrowed silk gown and offered a mock apology dripping with condescension, Sienna did not flinch. Instead, she offered a polite, chilling smile, quietly correcting Penelope's mispronunciation of the French designer's name before turning back to her conversation. Julian watched her from across the room, completely mesmerized. The woman he had hired was proving to be sharper and more formidable than any rival he had ever faced in a boardroom. Their forced proximity began to chip away at the walls they had built. Late nights in the penthouse turned into quiet conversations over scotch and tea. They debated art, philosophy, and the ruthless nature of the corporate world. During one heated argument, Sienna challenged Julian's entire worldview, telling him that his empire was built on a lonely, hollow foundation. Instead of firing back with his usual arrogance, Julian listened. He found himself looking for her in crowded rooms, his chest tightening when she smiled at someone else. When Sienna came down with a sudden, exhausting fever after a week of relentless press tours, Julian shocked his executive team by cancelling a multi-million-dollar merger meeting. He spent the entire day sitting quietly in a chair beside her bed, bringing her water and replacing the cool cloth on her forehead, asking for nothing in return. But the fragile trust they were building shattered on a rainy Tuesday evening. Julian was sitting in his home office when his head of security placed a thick, sealed folder on his desk. It was a routine background check on the Carter Foundation, the charity Julian had blindly wired $5 million to as part of their agreement. The security chief looked pale. The foundation, he explained, was a shell organization designed to quietly distribute funds to the victims of the Whitfield and Company financial collapse. The sole administrator of the trust was Sienna Whitfield, the disgraced and vanished heiress of the Whitfield empire. Julian felt the air leave his lungs. He walked into the library, dropping the dossier onto the table in front of Sienna. She looked down at the documents, her face turning pale as she realized what he had discovered. Julian's voice was dangerously quiet as he asked her how long she had planned to play him for a fool. Sienna stood her ground, her voice trembling but fierce. She confessed everything. She told him how her father had destroyed thousands of lives and how she had abandoned her inheritance, choosing to live in poverty as a nanny so she could funnel every spare cent back to the people her family had ruined. She looked him in the eye, tears brimming but refusing to fall, and told him that she expected a man like him to use this against her, just like everyone else in his world would. The accusation stung Julian deeper than he cared to admit. It was not her hidden identity that angered him, but the absolute certainty in her eyes that he was just another monster ready to exploit her. He did not yell. He simply turned and walked away, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake. For the next 2 weeks, the penthouse became a battleground of silent punishment. Sienna treated him with chilling professionalism, speaking to him only when necessary for the cameras, her warmth completely extinguished. Julian realized with a sinking dread that all of his wealth meant nothing if she would not even look at him. He stopped trying to buy her forgiveness with expensive gifts. Instead, he paid attention. When she worked late into the night reviewing foundation documents, she would find a cup of her favorite chamomile tea resting on her desk, steeped perfectly, with no note attached. He quietly fired a junior executive who made a disparaging remark about the working class in her presence. He gave her space, offering only small wordless gestures of respect and care, hoping to prove that he was not the ruthless shark she believed him to be. But just as the ice between them began to thaw, a storm gathered on the horizon. Penelope Ashby, furious at being sidelined and suspicious of Sienna's sudden rise from a mere nanny, had hired her own private investigators. Penelope had dug into Sienna's past and uncovered the same dangerous secret. As the Ashford Group prepared for the most critical shareholder summit of the decade, a summit that would finalize Julian's massive merger, Penelope saw her opening. She planned to expose Sienna's true identity to the press and the board, framing Julian not as a respectable family man, but as a conspirator harboring a fugitive from a disgraced, fraudulent empire. The trap was set, and the empire Julian had fought so hard to protect was about to be blown apart. The grand ballroom of the Ashford Tower was packed with hundreds of shareholders, journalists, and industry titans. Julian stood at the podium, delivering his final address before the merger vote. Sienna sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, presenting a picture of absolute composure. But the doors at the back of the hall suddenly swung open. Penelope Ashby marched down the center aisle, holding a microphone she had snatched from a startled audio technician, waving a thick stack of documents in her other hand. "Stop the proceedings," Penelope's voice echoed through the massive speakers, halting Julian mid-sentence. She reached the front of the stage, turning to face the bewildered crowd. "You are all about to hand control of a massive financial empire to a man who is actively harboring a criminal. Meet his lovely fiancée, Sienna Hayes. Or should I say Sienna Whitfield, the runaway daughter of the man who orchestrated the largest corporate fraud in this city's history." A deafening roar of whispers erupted in the room. Flashbulbs began to blind them as reporters scrambled for their cameras. Penelope smiled a venomous, victorious smile, throwing copies of the background check into the front rows. She expected Julian to panic. She expected Sienna to run away in tears. Instead, Julian calmly stepped away from the podium. He walked down the short flight of stairs and stood directly beside Sienna, gently taking her hand. The crowd slowly quieted, waiting for the billionaire to defend himself. "Penelope is entirely correct about the identity of the woman standing next to me." Julian's voice carried clearly across the silent room without a microphone. "She is Sienna Whitfield." What Penelope conveniently failed to mention is what Sienna has been doing for the last 4 years. While the rest of us were attending galas and protecting our wealth, Sienna abandoned her inheritance. She took jobs scrubbing floors and watching children, dedicating every single dollar she earned to anonymously repaying the victims her father had wronged. Julian reached into his own jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, handing it to a prominent journalist in the front row. "That is the financial ledger of the Carter Foundation," Julian continued, his gaze sweeping the room before locking onto Penelope. "It shows that Sienna has single-handedly restored the life savings of over 300 families. She has more integrity in her little finger than anyone sitting in this room, and certainly more than a woman who tries to use the misery of fraud victims to score cheap points in a corporate rivalry." The ballroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Then, one of the oldest and most conservative board members stood up and began to clap. Soon the entire room erupted into a standing ovation, not for Julian, but for Sienna. Penelope stood frozen, her face completely drained of color as investors and former friends turned their backs on her in disgust. Security quietly approached and escorted Penelope out of the building. She had lost everything, her reputation completely destroyed by her own vindictive trap. Later that evening, the penthouse was quiet. The merger had been approved with record-breaking support, but Julian did not care about the company anymore. He found Sienna on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. He walked up beside her, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders to ward off the chill. "You did not have to do that today," Sienna said softly, looking up at him. "You could have lost the company." "I would burn the company to the ground before I let anyone disrespect you," Julian replied, his voice rough with emotion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box containing the diamond ring. He did not open it. He simply placed it on the railing between them. "The contract is void, Sienna. The 6 months are over. You are free to go, and the foundation will remain fully funded for the rest of your life. But I am asking you to stay. Not for the press, not for the board, but for me. I love you, Sienna. I want a real life with you." Sienna looked at the box, then up into Julian's eyes. She saw no arrogance, no manipulation. She only saw the man who had sat by her bed when she was sick, the man who had risked his entire empire to protect her honor. She picked up the velvet box and placed it gently back into his pocket. Then she reached out and took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I do not need a ring to tell me who you are, Julian. I am staying." 2 years passed and the world had completely changed. Sienna and Julian were married in a quiet, private ceremony in the estate gardens, far away from the flashing lights of the press. Together they transformed the Ashford Group, dedicating a massive portion of its profits to expanding the Carter Foundation globally. On a warm summer afternoon, Julian sat under the same massive oak tree where he had first seen her, holding their newborn daughter in his arms. Sienna walked across the grass, leaning down to kiss them both. They had built an empire not on ruthless ambition, but on redemption, trust, and a love that could never be bought. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. See you next time.
Editar. El infográfico presenta la historia de Diana como un caso de fraude familiar, violencia patrimonial y recuperación de la autonomía. Dentro de su familia, ella ocupa el papel de jefa funcional. Y es responsable, organizado y siempre resuelve las crisis económicas, mientras Pablo recibe protección constante a pesar de sus errores. Con el tiempo, todos consideran normal utilizar los recursos de Diana para corregir las decisiones de su hermano. El conflicto se vuelve grave cuando Patricia y Pablo falsifican la firma de Diana y utilizan su fondo de inversión como garantía de un crédito millonario. No se trata solamente de una traición emocional. Es violencia patrimonial porque intentan disponer de sus ahorros, su identidad y sus documentos sin consentimiento. También existe fraude bancario, uso de documentación falsa y prisión familiar para encubrir el delito. La cena en la que Patricia anuncia que el dinero de Diana será usado para pagar la deuda muestra cómo la manipulación puede presentarse como una obligación moral. La idea de que la familia debe ayudarse busca convertir el abuso en sacrificio y la obediencia en una prueba de amor. Diana no reacciona impulsivamente porque comprende que una confrontación directa podría permitir que destruyeran pruebas. Por eso reúne registros de viaje, comprobantes laborales, videos, movimientos bancarios y evidencia de la notaria. Su conducta demuestra que protegerse no significa ser fría, sino actuar con claridad. La evidencia se convierte en su defensa frente a una familia que durante años utilizó la culpa para controlar sus decisiones. El infográfico también muestra un patrón social importante. Patricia intenta conservar la imagen de madre sacrificada y presenta a Diana como una hija egoísta. Parte de la familia acepta esa virgen porque existe una presión cultural que exige lealtad absoluta hacia los padres y hermanos, incluso cuando hay abuso. Diana termina convertida en el chivo expiatorio moral. En lugar de reconocer que fue víctima de una falsificación, algunos familiares la culpan por el arresto de Pablo y la pérdida de la casa. Las señales de alerta aparecen cuando alguien exige dinero con urgencia, minimiza deudas, presenta documentos no autorizados o utiliza el amor como instrumento de presión. También es peligroso impedir que la víctima busque asesoría legal o financiera, porque el aislamiento facilita la manipulación. El resultado final no representa una venganza. Pablo enfrenta consecuencias legales. Patricia pierde el control que ejerce sobre su hija y el patrimonio de Diana queda protegido. Ella comprende que no tiene la obligación de financiar el chaos de su familia ni de salvar a quienes se niegan a asumir responsabilidad. Al recuperar su fondo, vender el anexo y mudarse a su propio departamento, transforma una experiencia de traición en una etapa de independencia. La bugambilia del final simboliza esa reconstrucción. Sus nuevas joyas representan una vida que empieza a crecer fuera de la culpa, el miedo y la obligación. Diana no recupera la familia que imaginaba, pero recupera su nombre, sus límites, su seguridad y el derecho de decidir qué problemas está dispuesta a enfrentar. La enseñanza central es que poner límites no destruye una familia. Lo que destruye los vínculos es el abuso, la mentira y la falta de responsabilidad. Protegerse también puede ser una forma de dignidad, justicia y amor propio.